Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 45 of Series 7. The question for today is, what are values? Are they objective, subjective, or just indications of absence? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 3. It may seem mistaken to give a definition of value and valuing at the end of this series on various expressions of value, but we already have a working understanding of what value is and how it works in daily life, and the preceding workshops have also been providing an ostensive definition of value. Not only that, I have presented a principle of value in response to questions of life. So we must now provide a more explicit and detailed definition of value. More so because, despite its wide use, the concept of value has been subject to numerous misunderstandings. For example, value is an essential element in religion, but religion typically has no concept or theory of value. To do so would plunge religion into explicit understanding that would undermine religious reality. Another example is that conventional ways of defining value are mostly just applications of value, not definitions of value. For example, ethical, economic, aesthetic, family, religious, and scientific values. But beyond these views, I hold that values are essentially subjective and must be defined with internal features. And some of the defining features that we will look at ask whether values are subjective or objective, intrinsic or attributed, and valenced or ungraduated. Some more interesting features of value are selection, choice, preference, and quality. But before discussing such explicit features, we can look at some other different types or kinds of value. Viktor Kraft of the Vienna Circle, for example, classifies values as concerning morality, aesthetics, or utility. But we can also talk about perspectival, motivational, and experiential values. Perspectival values might also be described as cognitive values and applied to perspectives, value-laden facts, and bias. The term perspectival values is widely used by philosophers such as Bernard Williams and Thomas Nagel. Motivational values can include volitional and moral values of reasons for action and ethical principles. Moral values are recognized as a particular kind of value, but might only be one application of value. And thirdly, experiential or affective values are those like love, hate, desire, guilt, shame, disgust, and pity. But experiential values aren't often described as such, and even less frequently as affective values. To continue, we can note other examples of value like truth, justice, money, excellence, God, and beauty. But these leave out negative values like hate, deception, resentment, and death that we must include. Moreover, these are all examples of values as objects or mental states as objects. And there's another understanding of values as verbs, activities, or mental processes. Examples of values as actions or processes are liking, wanting, loving, and hating. This distinction can be described as one between values and valuing. These examples illustrate a known problem of the diversity of values. That is, many different states or objects may be masquerading as one concept, namely value. And I want to illustrate this problem with a discussion of the subjectivity or objectivity of value. And to introduce the discussion, I want to talk about another class of values that I'm also skeptical about. Examples of these are truth values, numeric values, monetary values, and values of quantity. My concern is that these values don't have the subjective experiential content essential to values. And on this view, these values only seem to be describable as values analogously. That is, they are described as values but should be described as properties or quantities or something like that. There are many examples of words with two meanings, but such ambiguity of meaning is usually understood. One example can be found in a joke about Singapore. Someone asks, "What do you think of Singapore?" They answer, "Fine, fine, fine, fine." The word fine here stands for both a compliment and a penalty. In the case of monetary value, an item might be designated with the value of $5. But what does this mean? Ralph Perry argues that values don't exist until someone desires something, and I agree with him. So on this view, the item might be labelled as having the value of $5 by a computer without anyone knowing about it. And because no one experiences that value by valuing it or by purchasing the item, its description of value is of a radically different kind to the experiential value that I discuss here. Moreover, I believe that describing such a value is not only misleading but erroneous. So that's why truth values, numeric values, and monetary values shouldn't be called values. And it's also an example of absence that I hold is understandably overlooked. This view is endorsed by a subjective theory of value, as Perry's above and John Mackie's celebrated argument holds. Mackie argues that there are no objective values in the fabric of the world, and therefore there are no intrinsic values. His arguments are about psychological propensities and the queerness of quasi-objective entities. I previously discussed this argument, so I won't go over it in detail here, but it's important to understand what he means. That is, in Mackie's argument, the word objective refers to substantive ontological existence, not universality. So here, the rejection of objective values doesn't preclude the existence of normative ethical values. I agree with Mackie, but on the grounds that values can't exist independently without a conscious human agent. Yet there are other problems with the idea of what must be pre-existing objective values. They must be infinite in number and meaning to cater to human complexity and unlimited possibility. And why should our subjective commitments concur with these objective injunctions? Yet I'm explaining here the subjectivity of value, not arguing against objective value. To that end, we can consider some challenges to Mackie's arguments. One, John McDowell points to the dependence of aesthetic value on the cognition of external objects. Two, the phenomenon of revealed values might suggest that values exist prior to being revealed. And three, the existence of intrinsic values in the world would also challenge Mackie's argument. But both Perry's and Mackie's arguments against objective values also hold against intrinsic values. And I will soon argue that the only candidates of intrinsic value are subjective mental states and people. Yet we shouldn't discount the mythological significance of objectivity or universality in an analysis of value. It is with such ideas as objectivity, truth, or God, that value can acquire its power and attraction. It's perhaps for such a reason why many religious and philosophical thinkers appeal explicitly to objective values. Such thinkers include Iris Murdoch, Susan Wolfe, Robert Nozick, and Ronald Dworkin. And Plato located values and ideas in a parallel but eternal and perfect realm. But how can we explain such belief in objective values? Is such thinking mistaken or confused, or is it particularly perspicuous? Confusion is certainly implied by Rage Jackendoff's own description of his account as the peculiar logic of value. He cites three features of value. 1. Valence as magnitude or intensity. 2. Different types or kinds of value. And 3. Subjectivity or objectivity. But he defines objectivity simply as shared or generic values. Jackendoff then gives us 8 types or kinds of value. These are affective, utility, resource, quality, prowess, esteem, normative, and personal normative or human value. My criticism of these is that they are mixed types, and some are only applications of value. For example, affective values are a kind of value, but utility and normative values are applications. And he also omits the 2 standard types of intrinsic and attributive values. Yet crucially, we still aren't talking about the inherent structures of value. Yet Jackendoff's peculiar logic of value and its apparent opacity and neglect also paradoxically reveal its character. This opacity follows from an error theory of consciousness, and similarly value as a state of consciousness. In this way, an outline of both the history and the neglect of value are vital to understanding it. And to understand the neglect of the concept of value, we need to go back to its origins in ancient Greece. Karl Marx tells us that Aristotle had no concept of value, but he may have overstated the point. The idea of value was well known in ancient Greece. The word for value in Greek is axia. Aristotle actually coined the word ethics, and Plato discussed inherent or intrinsic good. Yet neither the fact value or the is-ought distinctions were known in ancient Greece. And of course the concept of value was not used as a principle of ethics. Further to the idea of a restricted notion of ethical value in ancient Greece, Elizabeth Anscombe tells us that the term moral just doesn't seem to fit in its modern sense into an account of Aristotelian ethics, because, Anscombe explains, it lacks the concept of a moral sense of ought. Alistair MacIntyre took up Anscombe's work, and he informs us that, I quote, in Latin, as in ancient Greek, there is no word correctly translated by our word moral. Cicero invented morales to translate the Greek word ethikos, meaning pertaining to character. Moving forward to 1776, Etienne Bonan was the first economist not to agree with objective or utility value theory. He considered that both value and utility have a psychological substrate and result from individual interest. Summing this up and bringing us up to the present, Charles Gray Shaw wrote in the earliest 20th century, I quote, value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy. For example, Hume's discovery of the is-ought distinction came late, and it is still often overlooked today. And in the 19th century, science was regarded as objective and value-free. Now it's seen as value-laden. Also in the 19th century, Auguste Comte advocated a positivist and value-free sociology as a form of social physics. This view was followed by Rudolf Carnap and the logical positivism of the Vienna Circle. And on this view, value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. These considerations reveal both a neglect and a developing understanding of value as a subjective mental state. And this neglect raises the suspicion that something important has been overlooked, that is, the subjectivity of value. Yet what is also revealed is a bias towards cognitive explanations that we need to explore further. The fact-value distinction is a means of differentiating value that is also part of the cognitive non-cognitive classification. But the cognitive non-cognitive classification is biased in favor of cognition and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So in my view, we should replace the non-cognitive category with the more specific affect, will and value. This results in a classification of 4 types of mental states of cognition, affect, will and value. These 4 states can now help us to define value and different kinds of value by contrast and comparison. Yet we should first note that analytic philosophy regards such states as separate and distinct from each other, whereas phenomenology, existentialism and myself regard them as overlapping and interpenetrating. Examples of affect states include both feeling and emotion, such as pain, happiness, affection, despair and anger. Examples of cognitive states are thought, perception, reason, knowledge, belief and memory. With respect to the will, wanting is a directional capacity of the will that implies value, and choosing is a selective capacity of the will that also implies value. We will discuss value states like love, desire, hate and the goodwill shortly. So the noted diversity of values can now be defined by the relation to the above 4 states. But cognitivist theories like Kant's define value largely in terms of certain perceptions of things. John McDowell, for example, explains such in terms of favourable light or a certain perceptual capacity. And the fact-value distinction traditionally demarcates value by excluding it from cognitive states. But a more graduated view allows value to permeate into value-laden facts because of entanglement. For example, the social scientist Tristan Engelhardt holds that knowledge is always value-laden. Anthony Grayling described the world as being saturated with values, and Hilary Putnam put it in terms of the breakdown of the fact-value dichotomy. On this integrated and graduated view, desire can be defined as value state with a high degree of affective content, and love and the goodwill can have a greater cognitive content and a more refined affective content. Some religious thinkers, academics and existentialists like Shaw define value itself as having a high volitional content. And furthermore, value need not motivate action without will or volition, that is, volition embodied by action. And I've previously calibrated the character of values by their various objects like food, God, or truth. I also argued that more refined values are produced by diminishing degrees of cognition, and that such processes of will, value, and the will to value lead to a certain sufficiency of value. Yet to explain values as subjective experiences, as well as such sufficiencies of value, we need the concept of value states. That is, as noted earlier, values aren't just material or mental objects, but are activities and felt experiences. And as we increasingly define value in terms of interior subjective features, it becomes increasingly difficult not to use the term value states that I have coined. It's significant from the point of view of the neglect of value that I've never come across the term value states. And recent searches on both Google and ChatGPT produce the same result with the answer that I quote. The term value states is not a standard or widely recognized term in psychology, philosophy, or other fields that study human emotions, attitudes, or behaviors. Thank you, Mr. GPT. Now, some examples of value states are love, hate, dignity, self-esteem, honor, duty, resentment, and wanting. More precisely, value states necessarily contain values without which they would not exist. That is, value is a necessary constituent of value states like hate or self-esteem. Conversely, cognitive states like reason or perception typically don't contain value, and affect states like pain or pleasure can be valued but not necessarily. Yet we are using the term value states here to designate the subjectivity of value as a felt experience. And as we have seen, some value states are negative as well as positive. Our paradigm example of a positive value state is the proposed ideal objective of value sufficiency. This is a value state with a certain independence from supporting cognitive frameworks. And to take this analysis of value states, and value sufficiency further, we can now look at intrinsic values. This is the case because all sufficient values, like magnanimity and love, have intrinsic value, and that sufficient values are intrinsic values that are affirmed as such by a will to value. But not all intrinsic values have significant levels of value sufficiency, because intrinsic values can be trivial. For example, my love of dogs is of intrinsic value, but it is of less value than my love for my wife. And both the significance of sufficient value and the idea of a neglect of value become apparent in the analysis of intrinsic value below. To begin with, intrinsic values are usually contrasted to attributed or instrumental values. Intrinsic values are valuable due to their own inherent qualities. Instrumental values are attributed with value as a means towards some other end. To illustrate the idea of intrinsic value, consider different ways in which values are considered to be intrinsic. Money is accepted as tokens without intrinsic value. Valuables like gold are thought to have intrinsic value, but only in an economic context. Valuables are only valuable for what they appropriate, like houses or cars. But physical objects are only valuable for the satisfactions they bring. So in this view, ultimately, only mental states and conscious beings can have intrinsic value. Conversely, truth, beauty, and knowledge are traditional candidates of intrinsic value. William Frankenna names a long list of intrinsic values, including life, virtue, and consciousness. And the intrinsic value of certain principles, actions or objects is held by many prominent philosophers. These include G.E. Moore, Robert Nozick, Ronald Dworkin and Derek Parfit. Parfit claims that things like books and rational activity can have intrinsic value, and Dworkin tells us that paintings and great trees can have intrinsic value. In my view, the belief that such abstract or material objects can have intrinsic value is hugely mistaken. Yet it's certain that the disagreement between subjectivists like Perry and Mackie and objectivists like Parfit and Dworkin constitutes a schism that indicates a radical misunderstanding of the nature of value. The objectivist error is trying to explain value with the properties of the object rather than those of the agent. Moore and Nozick, for example, define intrinsic values by means of their organic unity or internal coherence. I myself define intrinsic value by means of its reflective capacity that assigns value to itself. Yet I discuss intrinsic value in much more detail in my earlier podcast number 17. But my objective here is only to elucidate value, intrinsic value and their neglect, not to argue against objective value. Yet my central point is that the neglect and misunderstanding of value stems from a neglect of subjectivity. And this is best redressed by explaining the foundations of value in subjectivity and consciousness. And consciousness is well explained by phenomenology, which connects value and consciousness. Sartre writes, for instance, that the being of the self is value. And he continues to say that reflective consciousness cannot arise without, at the same time, disclosing values. What we are saying here is that value and consciousness are coexistent. This is explained with a close identification between consciousness, value and choice as selection. For example, Sartre writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. That is, elimination and selection presuppose disfavour and preference as expressions of value. Yet Sartre writes, choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. And again, selection isn't just deliberated choice, but selection as part of an underlying structure. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis tracing choice back to its ontological foundation. This is because his ultra-phenomenological method prevents him from employing mental graduations, that is, from the unconscious, the preconscious, immediate consciousness, and to reflective consciousness. Yet we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness. Or we can continue to say that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value. For example, when I look left or right, I affirm what is on my right and negate what is on my left. These are the kind of selections that are essential to epistemic contrasts and perceptions. For example, a white spot on a white board can't be seen. It needs a contrast. And such contrasts are at the foundation of value and consciousness. But at least two objections can be made to this kind of explanation of incipient values. One, they are not the values we need in motivation, morals, meaning or purpose. Two, values also emerge from social and biological sources without selection or choice. In response to the exception of biological values, such must be experienced in consciousness in order to be values. That is, an automatic propensity to action is not a value. Such are only latent or potential values. They only become values on selections as preferences of mental states. For example, animals express preferences in procreation, nourishment, and survival behaviours. So animals are conscious creatures which can have values but not moral values. In response to explaining values of motivation, morals, or meaning, the above is an account of incipient values, and such an account of the origins of value includes the potential for the development of more substantive values. And Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl offer such an account of time that provides more substantial values. Heidegger emphasized temporality and time as the horizon of being. Husserl spoke of the flow of consciousness and the flow of becoming, in which every experience has necessarily been preceded in time by experiences. That is, we find ourselves in a world of time or temporality, as well as diversity, divisibility, selection and choice. The diversity of the world demands selections and choices that produce value. Yet consciousness is also moving through time as well as diversity in space, and substantive values must be thereby continually produced to cope with the flow of existence. The discussion so far has defined value in terms of its different types, that is, value states, intrinsic value, subjectivity, consciousness, selection, choice, graduation, and its neglect. We have also noted cognitivist, realist, and volitional theories of value, but we have omitted many others. One such is a cost theory that explains value in terms of cost or a price that is paid. Another is a desire-based theory that supposes values must be antecedently desired. Nozick cites one of the properties of value as possibility, and possibility marks out the space that thought, experience and aspiration can enter into. But possibility is a precondition of many human activities, not only value. For Sartre, value is a lack or absence, which might simply be describing what we do not have. Yet it accords with his negative appraisal of consciousness that brings nothingness into the world. And it also accords with a cost theory, as well as explaining a certain tension that we find in value. But it fails to account for sufficiencies of value like magnanimity, courage and love. Sartre also regards human consciousness as a useless passion, vainly seeking the permanence of physicality. But there's an alternative response to consciousness seeking the permanence of physicality. That is, replace the permanence of physicality with the more appropriate sufficiency of value. Yet we haven't had time to explain or discuss this sufficiency of value. We also haven't discussed a cognitivist issue of whether values must always involve mental objects. Yet in phenomenology, the question of mental objects can be discussed in terms of intentionality. The concept of intentionality was introduced by Franz Brentano, who made it a mark of all mental states. But others claim that states like pain and pleasure, or indeed value, need not intend towards objects. Yet I would like to compare value to an ocean current, as well as to a river flowing to an objective or an object. This brings intentionality to notice as having an interior quality as well as an external object. Husserl and Heidegger also preferred to use the term directedness rather than intentionality. And Tim Crane notes, Husserl's student, Twardowski's attention to the content of intentionality. Although we don't have time here to discuss this aspect of value either. And there's difficulty explaining experiential aspects of value like feeling and preference with theoretical accounts. These can only be approached with imagination and empathy for known human situations and experiences. Such appreciate the role of value in the experiences of morals, meaning, purpose, aesthetics, and religion. In religion, for example, God represents the believer's highest value together with a whole world of other values. Love is a mode of value with the different kinds of love representing different kinds of value. And a meaningful life is a worthwhile and valuable life lit up by values. I call explaining qualitative aspects of value the very hard problem, like Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. Yet we can also compare the qualia of value and consciousness. But Daniel Dennett expectedly denies both. Qualia are the feelings and experiences of the introspectively accessible phenomenal aspects of our mental lives. In this way, qualia can be said to help explain the experiential and qualitative aspects of value. Yet value also has a transcendent aspect of reaching for something beyond what already exists. And at this point, we are groping at the indefinability of truth, the goodwill, and human possibility. With that conclusion, we could round up with what we have not discussed as much as what we have discussed. One issue that we haven't discussed is whether values are always motivational or not. And must values be reflective, or can they be pre-reflective, as in the unconscious or in animals? This is also about the scope of value. This is a feature that we haven't had time to expand or make explicit. That is, from the origins of inner consciousness to its various expressions in the world, even in cognitive faculties. By comparison, our view of science or mathematics must go beyond our current understanding of them. That is, we believe that mathematics, or whatever, is a coherent system able to explain future problems that we haven't yet encountered. And our view of value must similarly include its widest context of explaining human life, including the resolution of evaluative problems of life like morals, meaning and purpose. Yet we have explained value as a fundamental constituent of consciousness, and other fundamental constituents like that is cognition, affect and will enabled us to make comparisons and contrasts. And this account not only emphasized the neglected subjectivity of value, but also its interiority. This included features like quality, selection, preference, choice, graduation, and intrinsic value. And finally, we have been discussing value because of its significance in a value perspective of human life. That is, value is proposed as a principle of life, as the will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. So next week we'll be starting Series 8 on consciousness as a foundation of these claims about value. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like meetup.com or Zoom.